you been avoiding conflict lately? Are you afraid that if you speak your truth to someone, you might damage the relationship permanently? Is inner conflict eating you up inside? Maybe you're thinking one thing, but doing another, and you just can't seem to get your head and heart to line up. As humans, we all deal with conflict. Join Jennifer McKenna now as she talks to business leaders about the importance of conflict and how we can all move through it with greater grace and ease, ultimately taking our relationships and our lives to the next level by facing conflict courageously.
Well, happy Thursday, everyone. Welcome to the show, Conflict Rising. We are having a part 2 conversation today with Jamie Harrell, who is so kind to come on and have a second conversation because I felt like the first conversation was so meaningful and in-depth and intriguing that I know for myself, I was left with as many questions as I was answers. And so I wanted to circle back around and have even go deeper into the conversation. I do think that, in the grand landscape of cultural shifts and all kinds of topics that are, if not overtly, they are potentially causing conflict in lives, I think transgender has been somewhat of a controversial topic because it is so misunderstood. And so one of the biggest objectives of this show is to fill in the blanks of questions that may linger and cause conflict so that we don't have to have conflict. We can be peaceful. We can live, we can cohabitate in a society that is prosperous because we are compassionate. And so I openly acknowledged then, and I will openly acknowledge now, that I am extremely ignorant about this topic. I learned so much from our first conversation. And I think I opened our last show by saying many years ago, almost 15 years ago, I was asked to facilitate a national conference with a transgender community on behalf of a federal health organization. And it was somewhat groundbreaking in terms of moving the dial on the understanding of the community. However, we did not get into the social aspects and the social evolution of gender in general. We were really looking specifically at health-related data. And so I remain 15 years later completely ignorant, with the exception of kind people like Jamie Harrell, who will come forward and help educate me. So I am speaking on behalf of all of those of you out there who are listeners who are ignorant about the topic too. And then there will be all of those listeners who are very well versed on the topic who are probably laughing their tails off, which is totally fine. I'm always happy to be the object of comic relief. So, Jamie, thank you for being on the show again.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm really excited to be back. I don't know how many of your guests actually get this honor to come back a second time, so thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I would say that you are the first, so I'm very, very excited. I have so many topics that I'm intrigued about that it's hard for me to prioritize bringing people on, even though I have thoroughly enjoyed every single guest I've had. But this is a topic that I think generates the most intrigue in terms of the amount of people who just don't know enough about it. And I am one of them. Sure. So I want to share with listeners, too, that you and I know each other because our daughters are very good friends. And so we have kind of been on the sidelines. I think we met your family right after you kind of acknowledged that you were transgender. And so we came into your lives, or you came into our lives in a really fresh space of the transition. And so I have a lot of questions just being kind of in your family's social circle, so to speak, and what it's like to be in my position with so many questions. But I do want listeners to know that because of that, you and I debriefed the last show very quickly after we ended the show and you called me out on something right away that I was so ignorant to. I thought, oh my God. Well, there you go. And that was that in the last show, I thought ignorantly that I was taking a journalistic approach by just kind of stating the facts of the news of Caitlyn Jenner's transition. And I positioned it by naming her dead name, which I thought that that was me just reporting news from back in 2015, because the dead name represents a true sports legend. I mean, I grew up in the 70s, and this person was on the Wheaties box, and anybody who made it to the Wheaties box in the 70s.
Of course, of course. I remember this, too. I ate my Wheaties when I was a kid.
Yes, and that was a really big deal for those of us who were kids in the 70s. And so with somebody who has such a legacy in our culture, I didn't realize that I had done something so taboo as to say this person's former name. So Jamie kindly called me out in the debrief, and the of course, because I claim ignorance openly, I just laughed like, oh my gosh, of course I did something so stupid. But what was mortifying was that I set the tone, because that was the first thing I said about the show. So part of today's show is to come back and let's reframe what dead names are and why what I did was such a crime. So Jamie, it's all yours. Take the floor.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And you know, being that it's something that you're not very aware with, sure. I mean, it's to be expected that people are going to make mistakes. And when you're trans, people make mistakes about your name, about your gender, and that's okay, as long as people begin to understand what it means and how it can affect us and how it can actually become dangerous for trans people. So that's why I like to talk about it. I didn't want to start the show last time immediately going on the defensive or even going on the offensive about you can't call that person that, or you shouldn't call us this or that, because I wanted to be respectful of your time and your place, as well as we had a lot more important things to talk about. But names and genders, can be very important. And when you look at this from, as you mentioned in your opening, talking about it from a historical perspective or a journalistic perspective, I would ask you to try to consider how we refer to other people when we talk about them in the past. We use their current name. So, for example, where did Michelle Obama meet Barack Obama? Well, she was really Michelle Robinson when she met Barack, right? But we would still say, tell me about Michelle Obama's childhood. And so because that's who they are now, that's how we refer to them and about them in conversation. And there may be some journalistic element that you say as a call-out and aside, formerly known as Michelle Robinson, or she was born as Michelle Robinson. But I don't think we really need to do that all that much. Another example, what movies, we're children of the 70s and 80s, what movies did Joaquin Phoenix star in as a child? Parenthood, Space Camp, some movies that we probably have seen. But wait, that was Leaf Phoenix. That wasn't Joaquin Phoenix. But do we say what movies was Leaf in as a child? We don't, because that's not who they are today. And we could keep going with this for quite a while. We could talk about when someone gets married. We don't spend years reprogramming our brains to use their new last name usually, because it's something to celebrate. And, but if we make a mistake and we call them by the wrong last name, typically we'll just correct ourselves and move on. And the same is true when you're talking about trans people. If you make a mistake, it's okay, as long as there's no malice or intent behind it. For example, if we disapprove of that marriage, we wouldn't intentionally call that person by their former name. That would be rude, right? We would probably keep that to ourselves. So speaking about names in the past of who people were before their transition is what we call a dead name. And it's generally considered rude. And I appreciate you letting me call you out on that, so to speak, on our second phone call, because it really can be important. The same is true with gender, because when that has changed, we don't want to use the pronouns of their former gender. We wouldn't say him when we refer to Caitlin anymore, even though way back then people would have referred to them as that. So, but something happened recently that really piqued my interest, that kind of highlighted this for me. So we live in a similar neighborhood, and we're both on this same Facebook neighborhood page, I think. And in this Facebook page, a really exciting thing happened. Someone was talking about their chickens in the neighborhood. And the city of Atlanta doesn't allow roosters. They only allow chickens. And so this person had posted that they don't know what to do, that one of their hens turned rooster. And I had no idea that this happened, but apparently I looked it up. Apparently it does. It's a biological thing. It happens that hens can occasionally turn rooster. And, it turns out, so can clownfish, and so can some reptiles and some moray eels. And the first thing that everyone did in the neighborhood when they were, replying about this really interesting situation is they said, you know what, the rooster has to go. The city of Atlanta does not allow roosters within the city limits because of the noise they make. And right, nobody ever called the rooster a hen again. They just said the rooster's got to go. And, we can have, all of this, interesting intrigue about people and their pronouns and their gender, but you know what? When it's a rooster, it's a rooster, so it's got to go. So that was really it was really comical to me that how quickly we see a dog. Is it a boy or a girl? Well, okay, it's a boy, and from then on you call it a boy. And I understand that when you have a relationship with a person over a long period of time, and then that gender changes, it takes a little reprogramming. It takes a little bit of intent and intention and attention to pay attention to those details. But that intent and that intention and the attention to that detail is important to us. And we really appreciate it when you get it right.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, too, that with the rooster situation, that when you further studied it and found that there are other animal groups that make this this gender transition, it's very interesting to me, because I always think nature shows us everything. Our lives are really reflections of nature. We go through internal seasons, we shed, when we're going through a major transformation in our lives, it's like a seed breaking open. It can be very painful, but then this new growth emerges, and there's just so many parallels with nature. So I find it fascinating because it does speak volumes to how slow we can be as a human race to really accept and honor a universal truth for a whole group of our society. This has probably been going on since the beginning of time, but we're just now catching up to it. So it's fascinating to me. But for those listeners, this is why we called the show Parenthood, Dead Names, and Roosters. Jamie and I decided after the last conversation, we have some more ground to cover here.
Yeah, it's really funny. Hens can turn roosters, and I think it's clownfish that are predominantly a group of either males or females. I don't know what it is, but when the lead, I think it's the lead is a female, passes away, one of the males changes gender and becomes the lead of that school. And it's really fascinating. But and everyone's like, hey, that's really cool. But when one person changes their gender, suddenly everyone's a sixth grade biologist that says, no, there's only XX and XY, and there's nothing in between shall ever be. And that's just not the way nature works. So it's really a fascinating parallel, because nature is not binary. And I think I talked a little bit about that. I don't want to get deep into the details of binary and non-binary, but it's really fascinating what we see in nature. And you're right. Nature shows us things that we don't expect.
Yeah, yeah. And really it's just our minds that get in the way, right? Our brains, I should say. When a lot of times when I'm teaching, I do a lot of coaching and teaching around change and behavior change and that type of thing. And the brain gets wired around certain belief systems, and those become our habits and become our patterns and become our addictions and those types of things because they run so often without our intervention. If we don't have conscious intervention, then the brain just runs on those programs all day long, and then we become so fixated on those beliefs and behaviors that we don't even notice anymore until they really start to wreck our lives. And, one of the things that I warn people about when they're starting the process of change is that the ego rears when it feels threatened, right? It's like the fight or flight response. It's like, oh my gosh, somebody's intervening. We are out of our comfort zone. This is high alert. Everybody take cover. We're going down. And it sends off that kind of crisis signal in the brain. And so that's what causes people to have egoic reactions to change, right? So if you're going to transition and somebody has what you would perceive as a very arrogant, malicious response, it's because their brain is sending off a signal inside of them that says, this is not good, this is not right, this is threatening. And so I'm always, as a coach and a teacher, trying to say to people, know that that is a process inside of you, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. It's on us to raise our consciousness to that process within so that we can harness it in a far more healthy and compassionate way. And I don't even mean healthy and compassionate toward others, toward ourselves as well. So we're about to take a commercial break. We've had an interesting kickoff. We're going to come back and we're going to do a deep dive into parenthood because as my friend, I have been, Jamie has intrigued me in this transition as the father of a child that I hold dear. So we will come back and talk about that. Stay tuned.
Connecting you with the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
OMTimes magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Connect at omtimes.com. OMTimes, creating a more conscious lifestyle.
I'm Kathy Williams, host of Sexy Mom Abundant Life radio show on Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. On the show, we explore living abundantly in every area of your life. Ways to let go of limiting patterns and beliefs and to step into the flow of creativity and possibility, knowing you are supported by the universe.
Opiates has taken everything and everyone I've ever loved away from me. Everything.
I blew my ankle out and I got prescribed pain pills by my doctor.
If making my detox public is going to help somebody, I'm all for it. So I just wish I would have had a warning.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth. A message from Truth, the Ad Council, and ONDCP.
So welcome back, everyone. We are having our part 2 conversation with Jamie Harrell about the transgender transition. And I am so eager to talk about parenthood. As we were going to the commercial break, I was explaining that we've been friends. Her daughter, I'm sorry. See, I have bad habits, Jamie. When I met this family, Jamie was my daughter's best friend's father. So I'm dying to know, Jamie, are you now her mother?
Well, I'm dying to know this too. This is one of these things that, that honest to goodness, sometimes I just don't know what to call myself. Okay. told
can
my
I
kids.
just say that gives me relief because I'm always a nervous wreck as to how to refer to you.
well, and I'll tell you this. I won't. Well, I was going to say I won't tell many people this, but since it's on the radio, I think I'm just about to tell everyone this. I have misgendered myself as well. So it's okay when this happens, as long as it's like an oops, okay, you move on. And that's probably a confusing point for a lot of people too, right, about misgendering myself. But it happens. I did it this morning in the car driving Sparrow to school. But in terms of am I dad, I've told my kids that they can call me dad as long as they want for their entire life. If they want to call me dad, they can. I'll just look a little more glamorous than the other dads who are dropping them off at school or walking them down the aisle, etc. I mean, it's going to be confusing to some people.
That.
It's going to confuse some people. There's one place that I've told them, I said, when we're traveling, because, and I may have mentioned this in an earlier conversation, but when we're taking a road trip, we drive down to Florida to visit grandma, and we stop at a rest stop or a restroom along the way, and we use the ladies' room, because if I went into the men's room, people would really stare at me. So we go into the ladies' room, and I tell my kids, I remind them, please don't call me dad in the bathroom. And so that's the one place that I tell my kids that I would really, really rather not be referred to as dad. Now, they have that license perpetually. That's not necessarily true of everyone else in my life. That license to call me dad or call me a father, there's an expiration date on that. And when that is really depends on what your relationship is with me. I would not want, well, this happened just the other day. One of the neighborhood mothers asked me if I could pick up their daughter from school. Now, I haven't met this mother face to face, but we've corresponded before. And so when I was picking up her daughter, I said, well, send me her text number so I can text her when I get there so that I can, she can find me and know my car. And so I texted her and I said, this is Sparrow's mom. I'm here to pick you up. Because if I said dad, she probably would be looking for somebody else and maybe get into the wrong car. So it could be a safety issue for both the other person as well as for the trans person. And where you definitely, please, would not call me dad would be in public with people who don't know that I'm trans. Because that's my message to deliver. If I choose to, it's not your message to deliver and out me, because in some situations being outed can be dangerous. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I mean, this is the absolute extreme, but this year there have been 18 transgender women of color murdered. And for the most part, this happens because typically their boyfriend becomes angry because someone else finds out that they're dating a trans woman. And that makes them look gay. And they're so afraid of being gay that they murder the woman who they love. And wow. In 40, I know, right? And in 49 states, it is legal to use the affirmative defense of murder called trans panic defense. I didn't know they were trans when we hooked up. I found out they were. I panicked and I killed them. Yes, I did it, but I did it out of a panic and fear. And fear being the root of the word transphobia. When we talk about transphobia, it's really the fear of trans people, which really ties in to how you close the last block. It's that part of your brain that kicks in this fear that generates these emotions. It's not hate or anger, it's fear. So being outed as trans can be dangerous. You don't know who is in the bathroom stall next to you. And so I asked my daughter not to call me dad in the ladies' room. For the most part.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, for the most part.
I just want to clarify. Sorry, I want to clarify. Did you say that in 49 states that is a legitimate excuse?
It is a legitimate defense that you can use the affirmative defense in being charged with murder. Yes, I did it, but I did it because they were trans. It doesn't mean you're going to win that defense, but it is legal to use that. And some people have been acquitted as a result. I think there was a pretty high-profile case, a military case going back about 10 years ago of a military, it might have been a sailor overseas who met a local and ended up, having drinks and then killing this person and using the trans panic defense.
Oh my God.
One state, yes, I know, it's awful. One state, California, I believe it is, has banned that. You are not allowed to use that. But that's one state out of 49 where I could ostensibly go on a date and be murdered, and the person could say, yes, I did it, and it's because I didn't know that she was trans, and ostensibly not be held accountable for that. So it can be dangerous. This isn't really a problem for me. Typically, this level of danger is really affecting people who don't have the privileges that I have.
And how would you define those privileges?
The privilege I have is being well off, being white, living in an affluent neighborhood, living in a decent house, having a stable work, having a stable family, having a fallback of having a supportive family. If I were to be fired from my job, which, goodness, we'll probably even talk about that today. If I were to be fired from my position because I was trans, which is legal right now in Georgia, I could actually go live with my mother. I could live with my sister. I would have a place to go. For a lot of trans people, that's not true. And so that's a privilege that I have that a lot of trans people don't, because they've been kicked out of their house. They've been disowned. They've been, taken out of the will. They'll never have the same family that they had before their transition because of this transphobia, this fear, which is why I like having these conversations, because people, particularly when I don't challenge you the minute that, we start a conversation, right? People realize that we're people too with hopes and dreams, and we love our children, and, we're just the same as everybody else, which is why I like having these conversations, because it really opens up that dialogue. It's hard to hate up close.
Yeah, I agree. And I really appreciate the conversation, because I have been saying for years that naivety and complacency are two of our biggest problems as a society. They sound so innocent, right? But I've been naive for the better part of my life, and I know it's gotten me into a whole lot of trouble. And so I think that's what you're tapping into. Someone like me who would inadvertently make the error of misgendering you verbally in a public place, it would never come from malicious intent. Right. It would be nothing but pure naivety and a slip of habit, right? Because, and for me, what's so challenging, and I even did it on air, I accidentally called you the wrong gender. It is because in my head, you are this child's dad, and I'm trying to honor you and still give her normalcy in my existence, right? And so, not that your gender is not normal, but in society, when a child's developing at those stages, it's difficult psychologically for a child to go through a gender transition. I'm guessing, right? I mean, that seems to be logical. It's hard for all of us, including you. I mean, so in my head, I'm still breaking the habit, and it's not coming from any type of space other than ignorance and naivety, which is why I'm so passionate about having the second conversation. So as you're describing this, it's just so eye-opening to me, because these are angles of the conversation that would never have occurred to me.
Well, and it's also important to understand that when it comes to the damage that can be done to marginalized people, the intention doesn't have any weight on the outcome. And so the outcome of outing me could be very, very horrible. But the intention could have been, there could have been no intent for that. So that's why I like to have these conversations, because it can cause very significant harm. And, so what would you call me if you were talking to a friend, and that friend doesn't know me? Maybe you would call me Sparrow's parent.
Mm-hmm.
The gender neutral forms of words can be used. You don't have to always say he or she. You can say they. It was added to the dictionary just last week as an official singular pronoun, they. You can use this to talk about one person. Who's on the phone? What are they calling about? It's one person, and they are calling about trying to sell me something. We use these terms colloquial every day. Finally was added to the dictionary and to the fanfare of many trans people, and to the chagrin of conservative people saying that we're corrupting the language. But it's always been used this way or it's been used this way for quite a long time. But yes, it can be dangerous. So if you are in a situation where you can't determine someone's gender, well, you just use their name. And that's even easier, mm-hmm. because from that point, there is no he or they. It's just their name. But make sure you use their current name, not their dead name.
Yes, of course. Yes, we've learned that.
right. Yeah. So, but parenting, you said that you suppose it might be really hard. A gender transition might be really hard on kids. And I would counter that by saying it's only as hard on the kids as the two parents of those kids really make it. And that's also a function of how old they are and a function of their gender as well. Mm-hmm. Young men seem to have more difficulty with parents that transition than young women do, because gender is there's been so many stereotypes of gender put into our young children by the time they're in their teens that being feminine is weak and being masculine is strong, right? I mean, this is a message that society does portray quite often. And so a young man seeing another person they perceive to be manly become feminine is unbecoming of that person, so because it is moving from a position of strength to a position of weakness. So that can cause some issues. But I think from a psychological perspective, I really think that young kids take on the attitudes that the parents give them about this type of thing. My kids have been fabulous. They seem to have weathered this quite well. I think we talked a little bit about that in our last conversation, that at one point, my daughter, my youngest Anna, we were at the playground at the elementary school, and she drug one of her friends up to me and says, "Look, my dad's a girl." And, it was naive and happy-go-lucky, and it was innocence and youth. And young kids have that pliability. They don't have the biases built in yet that we instill in them as parents. And so if you have two parents, one of them transitioning, and they have a very adversarial relationship, that's the kids that have the worst trouble. And I've seen a lot of couples, one person transition, and they were already in an adversarial relationship. They were getting a divorce, and things got really ugly, and they hold that or use it against them, again, from that place of fear. They hold it against them, and then they will, talk bad about that parent. And of course, what does that do to kids? I mean, goodness, right. When one parent is talking negatively about the other, that's just a horrible place to be. But if you're in a place that you can be cordial and friendly, you may still separate like we did, but you don't have to fight and bring that fight into the kids' lives. And I think I've seen, young children go through it with the parent transitioning with no issues whatsoever, like my children, at least none that are, that are causing issues in our family at this point.
This reminds me so much of when I went through a divorce, because I can remember, people would suddenly start treating me like I had the plague, and that there was some virus I was carrying that they were going to catch if they were anywhere near me. And it was a very, very isolating time in my life. And it was particularly hard because my parents had been happily married for 50 plus years. His parents had been happily married for 50 plus years. We had two children. And we made a pact that no matter what conflict we had, and no matter how much resentment we may have generated through the process, we were going to work it out. We were going to find a way to find peace because our children were going to be as minimally impacted as possible. And to this day, I swear to you, we are 10 years past that divorce. Our children are teenagers and they are thriving. And I feel like you do about the transgender, impact on your family. It's how we handled it. It's how you handle it.
Absolutely.
And I think that also speaks to the privilege you cited earlier, that you have, your parenting partner is a phenomenal person that I adore. And I think that you have that person who, like my ex-husband and I, you just work through your conflict until you get there. You just do it, on behalf of the kids.
Yep.
And I think that's a huge differentiator.
It absolutely is. Now, let's talk about confusion. What name shall I call you after you got divorced?
Oh, I'm still confused about that. So as you misgender yourself,
Right.
I'm 10 years out, and I will say this. Every time I call somebody, like a customer service, I have to start out and say, I'm not sure which name you have me under, because I don't even know what name I am. And part of that is because my last name, McKenna, I named my daughter McKenna. So I still go by my married name because I don't want people to think her name is McKenna.
Now that could be dangerous, right? Thank you for letting me joke along with that. But no, I call customer service and I'm like, okay, have I changed my name on this account? I don't know.
Right.
So yes, there are certainly some parallels. And changing your name at TSA, what a horrible experience to have to go through. I don't care if it's because of gender transition or if it's because of marriage or you just don't like the name that your parents gave you at birth. What a horrible process to go through. I started my name change with TSA a year and a half ago. A week ago, my pre-check expired under my old name.
Wow. Okay, so we've got more to discuss before we wrap up this show. We're going to a commercial break, so stay tuned, and we're going to continue this fascinating conversation with Jamie Harrell. Stay tuned.
Free your mind with OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Imagine being fired because of who you love. Imagine being denied medical treatment because of who you marry. Imagine being evicted because of who you are. Millions of Americans don't have to imagine this. They have to live it. Because in 31 states, it's legal to discriminate against LGBT people. Get the facts at beyondido.org. Brought to you by the Gill Foundation and the Ad Council.
Welcome back, everyone. So, Jamie, before we went to commercial break, we're talking about so many different angles of names changing in parallel to gender changes. And I just want to say this last thing, and then we're going to move on, because I know there's a lot of ground we still have to cover before we wrap up the show. But this whole conversation reminds me of years ago when a very dear friend of mine changed his name. And when he changed it, it was a very, very big deal because his old name represented a childhood. It was a name that his father gave him. His father was abusive. He was kind of just making a statement and putting a stake in the ground to say, this is the name I identify with. That name brings back, painful memories. And it became such an emotional, not emotional in a bad way, but a very passionate transformation in his life. And because he was a dear friend, it meant so much to me. But I kid you not, it was the same thing as the gender transition. I had the hardest time remembering out of force of habit, his name would just roll off my tongue. Just like, the wrong pronoun will just roll off my tongue when I think about you. And you're near and dear to my heart. And I'm trying so hard to get my brain to line up. Like, stop doing that.
Right,
and I will tell you, the good news is that all these years later, I can't even fathom calling this person his old name anymore. But it did take me a while in the beginning to really make the transition in my brain. I don't know how else to say it. It was just on autopilot. So that's where I am with a lot of the transgendered language is I know better now, thanks to you, but I still have to discipline my brain and my vocal cords to get in sync.
Yes, of course. And it takes time. I get that. And most trans people get that because sometimes it takes a while for us to adjust as well from what we've been conditioned to believe our name is. What we've been told our gender is, and people make mistakes. And I think I've said this many times, but I can't say it enough. When you make a mistake, you simply say, I'm sorry, you correct yourself, and you move on. And that, rather than calling a spectacle to it or making a big deal out of it, because that makes it a big deal rather than letting it roll off. But there is an expiration date to the forgiveness that you get. Because it actually does hurt. And I bet your friend who, if you accidentally had called him that name too many times, there would have been a point where he would have said, you know what, I don't want to be around you because you keep, you're recreating this trauma for me of my childhood. And I think it's important for people to understand that for a lot of trans people, that's true too. It recreates trauma that they have had in their life. From, their childhood of being, maybe it happens a lot, maybe they were disowned as a child, maybe they were kicked out, maybe they were homeless for a little while because they were declaring their gender and declaring themselves and their parents didn't like it. So there's all kinds of traumas that can have them relive. So, but I do want to actually revisit one more topic. I know you've got lots of questions, but in our first conversation, I brought up where I made reference to a military surgeon from the early 1800s that I just really want to circle back on because this is really fascinating because I've actually got a little more detail about it this time. His name was James Berry. He was born in 1789, died in 1865, and was a military surgeon in the early 1800s. And he served, I believe, with the British Navy in South Africa. And he was the first physician in South Africa, Western physician, to perform a cesarean section where both the parent and the baby survived, which is a huge landmark.
Wow.
When he died, the process back then was, I guess, cleaning and washing the body and whatnot. The person who did this discovered that Dr. Berry had female anatomy. And Dr. Berry, at his death, was discovered to have female anatomy. And he had lived his military career as a physician, he had at one point had become I believe, the Surgeon General of the British Navy. He had lived his life as a man. And it's just, we talk about this is, people might say that this is something new. It's, happening too frequently. It's all coming up all so fast. This has been happening for a long time. And in some historical circles, Dr. Berry might be referred to as she because they went to the anatomy. But I would say someone who had that much intent to live their entire life as a man, was probably transgender and was probably a female-to-male transgender person in the 17 and 1800s. So James Berry is the name. I think there's even a documentary or a movie coming out on this pretty soon, but it's definitely fascinating. So now, on to your question.
You keep bringing up all these things that have such personal ties to me, and it's so interesting because I actually, when I delivered my first child, it was so physically traumatic to my body with everything that happened, and we won't go into those gory details, but I remember my obstetrician looking at me at the foot of my hospital bed, and he looked at me with such seriousness, and he said, yours was a classic case of why we have C-sections, because your husband would have had to make a choice between you or the baby.
Oh, my gosh. How could you make that? How could you make that choice?
Yeah. And so this person that you're talking about, has had a significant impact on my life all these years later. So, one of the things that I just really love about our conversations and talking to you specifically is that you bring to light the angles of the situation that really are undeniable truths about how to respect people. And I want to call that out for a second because I think that, some of the things we've been talking about, I can hear voices from my cultural upbringing, and I'm not talking about in my family because my parents were very compassionate people. But, your culture is your community, the, geographic location where you grew up or the religion you grew up in or whatever. So if you look at the greater landscape, I can hear voices of people who still, even if you say something like, I don't want to be your friend because of the expiration date because it calls up trauma, there's this old school mentality of, get over it. What are you talking about? This is so, this is so high maintenance, or this is so, and I just want to say, first of all, I hope that's a growing minority, right, that think that way.
I hope so too. Yes.
But the second thing I want to say about that is, it is not for us to ever judge what causes pain within someone.
Of course.
And I think that simple truth is overlooked a lot.
Yeah. And it's not okay to tell someone to get over it when you're not feeling what they're feeling.
Exactly. And that's when it comes to empathy, right? And one of the things I've learned over the years is that when you have people with antisocial personality disorders, like sociopath or narcissistic personalities and so forth, their brain physiologically is not able to feel empathy and compassion. And so those are the loud voices that manipulate others, and the fear, right? So it goes back to the dangers of fear, the phobias, because somebody can be a good person with a strong fear and be more apt to act on it or give it power if someone else who lacks empathy plays into it. And so I'm just taking a moment to call all these things up to all of our conscious minds, that we be mindful advocates of compassion and empathy in our own social circles. And I don't say that to create more divisiveness where everybody gets together and says, oh, those people are terrible and they're bad and they should be this way and not that way. It's really more about people with differing opinions and being able to approach them with compassion and empathy to make it safe to discuss these things?
That's important, what you just said, because, and I want to tie this to a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's a good friend, but is very conservative, tried to stir the pot, so to speak, about young children in the bathrooms at school and what bathrooms children should use. And the way that he approached this was that, you know, my child is not comfortable going to the bathroom with your child if they're transgender. And I said to him, I said, you're framing this wrong. It's not about being uncomfortable, because no kid has the right to be comfortable, but every kid has the right to safety in school, including the trans kid. And when you talk about having a place of safety, I think that just really resonated with me, because that's really, for a lot of people, what these conversations are about, is how to be safe. And it might be an uncomfortable conversation, but we can be safe in having that conversation. So thank you for saying that. It really resonated well with me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think it's a really big issue that we all have to become more and more acutely aware of and not combative about, right? We can't meet conflict with combat. And I know that that's a habit of most humans. It's a natural instinct. But if we don't start to practice intentionally compassion in all facets of our lives, then we're really not going to be able to move through conflict successfully. And we're not going to create safe, and when I say safe, I mean physically and psychologically safe communities. Yeah. And they're both equally important. In many cases, you can't have one without the other.
Correct.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
And so I wanted to kind of crack that nut that's underneath a lot of the conflicts that this issue. You know, we've been talking in such a friendly manner about all these things, but there are potentially people out there listening who may not like that we are talking about these things in such a friendly manner, right? Who may find a real problem with so much of what we are discussing. And so I just wanted to call that out before we ended the show today. So before we wrap up, I did want to ask, because I want to give you plenty of time to think about this and give a thoughtful answer, as you always do. But what would you want cisgender people to, remember most about our conversation, or be thinking about, or to start to consider? And by the way, we haven't talked about cisgender today, but we talked about it in the first episode. So why don't you just touch on that briefly and then answer the question if you don't mind.
Sure. So cisgender is the word we use for people who are not transgender. So you are cisgender and I am transgender. And cis is merely CIS. It's a prefix to the word gender, and it means the same. And so your gender that you were assigned as birth is the same that you live and you feel inside of your brain and every day. Versus me being transgender, my brain was different than what I was perceived to be at birth. So I transitioned, and that's where the cis and the trans come from. And, I think we use these words so that we don't have to use words like normal woman or the biological woman, and terms that can sound a bit derogatory to those people who are not in that category. So we use cis and trans, and there's nothing derogatory about saying cis. It's just descriptive of who you are. So what would I want people to remember about our conversation? And I think a lot of people see trans people as different and other, but I would tell you that we're strong. And some of the trans people that I know are some of the strongest people I have ever had the privilege of having the company with in my life. And I think a lot of cisgender and heterosexual people could take a cue from the LGBT people around them and really examine their lives and see what's important to them. And I think there's a trans woman who I really, really admire, Samantha Allen, who's also from Emory. There's a quote that I want to read from her that I want to put out here. It says, "When you see people pushing past shame and fear to assert themselves in a world that wants them to stay hidden, it often unlocks something for you." And that's the journey that we trans people go through. And I hope for your audience that these conversations unlock a compassion for those of us who are different than you are. And hopefully the realization that you can do better to make us feel welcome in this world, whether that means getting our names and pronouns right or actively fighting against the discrimination that we face every day. So I really hope that these conversations are helpful to your audience, both cis and trans, in unlocking that compassion.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end the show, because I know that knowledge is power. When we educate ourselves, we are more free, and we are more free to love, and we should choose love over fear. And I think, you have to be strong to be transgender in today's world. And I applaud all of you who have committed to liberating yourselves to be who you know you are, in spite of what others may think. And I cannot thank you enough for being on my show, not once but twice. And I hope to see everyone else next week. But yes, thank you, Jamie, so much. So I'll see everyone else next Thursday on Conflict Rising.